Great. Why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many students, alumni, faculty supporters joining us today. For those who may be less familiar with us, we're a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security sphere, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost on college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners on U.S. foreign policy for some debates with their own faculty. Our over 1,000 alumni are serving across the national security and foreign policy space. If you're interested in getting more involved with us at any level, please visit alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. It really is today a pleasure to welcome Professor Niall Ferguson to AHS. Dr. Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University and a Senior Faculty of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He's also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's the author of 15 books, including The Pity of War, The House of Rothschild, Empire, Civilization, and Kissinger, which is really, I think, just one of two, the first volume of a biography of Henry Kissinger. He's an award-making filmmaker, too, having won an International Emmy for his PBS series, The Ascent of Money. And in addition to writing a regular column for Bloomberg Opinion, which if you've read it over the last few months, you'll see a lot of it is on doom or like-minded topics. He's also the founder and managing director of Green Mantle LLC, an advisory firm. And he's here today to discuss his latest book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. While the rest of us ran for the hills these past 50 months, he's actually written a book that attempts to place COVID and catastrophes writ large into historical context, and that despite the title and the ominous cover image, that it's actually not as bad as we thought. And so more importantly, in Doom, he tries to give us a generalizable theory or generalizable understanding of how political institutions and leaders handle catastrophe. So before I begin, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And to do that, please just submit your questions through the Q&A function in the dashboard at the bottom. And when we turn to that section, I'll call on you and figuratively hand you the mic. Professor Ferguson, thanks for being with us.
Gabe, it's great to be with you. Alexander Hamilton is a name that I've long been happy to be associated with. My mother's family name is Hamilton, and of course, Hamilton had Scottish roots via the Caribbean. So we had a kind of special place in our affections for Hamilton, even when I was growing up in Glasgow. And then when I moved to New York University in 2002, I got to know Dick Silla, the great financial historian of the United States. And he and I used to sit around and talk about Hamilton when Hamilton was really a figure partly lost in historical obscurity. When we would say to one another, Hamilton was the only founding father who really got where this country was going and who wouldn't be too surprised if he saw it today. And so it was really quite a sort of snobbish thing to know about Hamilton 20 years ago. And then, of course, all that changed and he became the most famous founding father thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda. Anyway, I was delighted to be invited to talk to you and to become involved with this society. I'm really, really delighted.
Great. Well, I'd like to think it's more popular today because of us, but I will have to grant the musical its fair due. So, and I think you're right. I think you'd have quite a lot of commentary on the moment we were in, whether it's populist politics or some of the many other things. But today we're here to talk about catastrophe, and I guess some people might consider populist politics catastrophe, but I think we'll narrow in on the definition you've chose. So, 18 months, I think, after the first incident of COVID-19. 4 million or so dead globally, which is almost certainly an undercount, including, I think 600,000 here in the United States. The worst economic decline in the United States in almost a century, decline in the major trust of institutions, a difficult moment in race relations, a violent mob took over the US Capitol. I mean, this really has been annus horribilis by every sense of the definition. And yet, to me, the argument you make in Doom is that this isn't that bad by the historical standards of catastrophe. And my sense is you're trying to offer a corrective to the perception that the current state of affairs is neither that rare nor that exceptional. So maybe you can try and explain to us why you're less gloomy about our current doom now that you've really kind of dug into the kind of history of doom.
Well, part of what happens every time a disaster strikes is that journalists dash to the scene and say that it's unprecedented. and the worst disaster in history. This is the consequence of journalists not having studied much history by and large. And whenever you hear the word unprecedented or a disaster like no other, what you should do is just reach for a history book and throw it at the screen, because pandemics are anything but a novelty in human history. In the book, I go all the way back to Thucydides, who talks in his history of the Peloponnesian War about the great plague that struck Athens, a disease that well nigh killed him, did kill Pericles, and show that recurrently throughout history, there have been these disastrous public health events. And by the standards of the great pandemics of history, this is only just now in the top 20 in terms of the percentage of the world's population that it's killed. And this may come as a surprise to some people listening, but it only recently overtook the death toll of the Asian flu of 1957-58. And so one has to sort of first just get the magnitudes right. We don't really know what share the biggest plagues in history, one the plague of the Emperor Justinian during the Roman times, the other the Black Death of the 1340s or thereabouts. But it was a huge proportion. One estimate in a pretty good paper that tries to quantify it is that something like a third of humanity succumbed to the great bubonic plague epidemic or pandemic of the 14th century. And we are coming close to 0.05%. Even if you take the very highest estimate that The Economist magazine came up with recently when it tried to recalculate and account for the undercounting of excess mortality in developing countries, you're still looking at something like 0.17% tops. That is an order of magnitude smaller than the death toll of the Spanish influenza of 1918-19. So this disaster is closer, a lot closer to 1957-58 than to 1918-19, and forget about the Black Death. That's interesting to me because almost nobody remembers the 1957-58 Asian flu. It's almost completely absent from histories of the 1950s. And so I think we have to ask ourselves a question, which I do in Doom. Why is this kind of medium-sized pandemic proving to be so consequential, as you rightly said, economically, politically, and geopolitically? Because if all you knew about it was the death toll in relation to global population, you wouldn't really have predicted such enormous consequences. Certainly, the 57-58 Asian flu did not have significant economic or political consequences, which is why it's largely forgotten.
So and that kind of takes us, I think, to your main argument, which is the crux or the foundation, let's say, of your argument is that no catastrophe is truly natural. And the point is that politics, human decisions, those are the things that transform a phenomenon, let's say, into a disaster. And I even remember in the early years of the Obama administration, when they wanted to get away from the language of the war on terror, the Secretary of Homeland Security came out and referred to terrorist attacks as man-made disasters. So maybe you can kind of explain for us, why or how, maybe in your mind, and whether it's COVID or kind of the theory in general, what makes a catastrophe a catastrophe?
Well, I use a straightforward definition. If there's a lot of excess mortality, a lot more people die than you were expecting or than had died in the previous 5 or 10 years, then something pretty disastrous is probably going on. I don't deal in the book much with disasters that don't cause a lot of excess mortality. There's really just one chapter that looks at small disasters that had big ramifications. So if you're interested in the Titanic, if you're interested in the Space Shuttle Challenger, if you're interested in the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, that is covered. But most of what I look at are big disasters that killed a lot of people. Now, one of the most obvious distinctions that people carry around in their heads is between natural and man-made disasters. And it seems intuitive that a pandemic's natural because some kind of virus or some other pathogen comes along to which we have no resistance, and there's a big spike in mortality. Whereas a war, which can have the same effects if you're just looking at mortality data, that's man-made. That distinction, I think, is a false one. And it's not an original point. Amartya Sen, the great Nobel laureate economist, made this point years ago about famines. Sen's point was that although the Irish famine of the 1840s or the great Bengal famines of the 18th and 20th centuries might seem like natural disasters that had their origins, in the case of the Irish famine, in a potato blight. In truth, it was human agency, whether through the operation or non-operation of markets or through political action, that caused the excess mortality. And Sen's subordinate argument was, and that kind of thing doesn't happen in a democracy where there's accountability. Famines, he argued, were peculiar to non-democratic regimes. And that's a very widely accepted argument, one of the reasons I think that Sen won the Nobel Prize. And I remember thinking last year as I was working on Doom, why would that only be true of famines? I mean, why is it not true to say that a pandemic is also not strictly a natural disaster? Now, increasingly people believe, and I think it'll turn out to be right, that this virus originated in a lab leak in Wuhan and not in a wet market. We don't yet know. We may never know because the Chinese are doing their best to cover it up. But if they're doing their best to cover it up, then we should probably be somewhat suspicious. So in a narrow sense, it's quite plausible to say today that the COVID-19 pandemic was man-made. It originated in human error. Even if the virus itself was of natural origin, it was not accidental that this thing was being subjected to research in a laboratory in Wuhan, and human error led to the leak. So that's the narrow definition. But there's a broader point that I think is more important. If you look at this virus, it had radically different impacts on different countries. In some countries, there has been no excess mortality. If all you knew were the mortality statistics for Norway, to take one example, or Taiwan, to take another, you wouldn't know that there had been a pandemic. Whereas the mortality data for the United States very clearly show the worst year in terms of excess mortality probably since 1918, as far as I can figure it out. It's hard to do these long run things, but it looks like we really haven't had a spike in mortality like this since the Asian influenza. So why was it so much worse here? And that, I think, is very clearly a political question. It's not biologically explicable. We basically screwed up, particularly in the opening phase of the pandemic, but we continued to screw up most of last year. And we only started to get things right with Operation Warp Speed. I mean, if you're going to get one thing right in a pandemic, get vaccination right. So, phew, the most important thing we got right, or pretty right. But everything else we basically screwed up in ways that Taiwan and South Korea and a bunch of other countries didn't. So I think that illustrates the point of my subtitle, The Politics of Catastrophe. All disasters, even what seems to be natural disasters, cause excess mortality according to politics, according to human agency. And that's even true of a volcanic eruption. I mean, a volcano on a deserted island, unless it's cataclysmically large when it erupts, is not really going to kill that many people. But if you decide to build a huge city right next to the volcano and rebuild it after the volcano's erupted once before, then it's not a natural disaster if a whole bunch of people die the next time the volcano erupts.
So let's stay on that. On those, you made two really good points there, which is about, in some ways, the time horizon, let's say, of decision making, using the volcano example, and then the other is the questions of political order, almost, and political decision making. So I don't think you use this analogy in the book, although I may have missed it. But in my mind, a lot of what you're talking about is sort of the powder keg and the match. The powder keg is a lot of decisions that have been made over time, poorly maybe, but they don't necessarily get realized until the match gets lit. And even to use another analogy, it's a war you know very well, World War I, as an example. On the one hand, there's a match, the supposed bolt from the blue theory and so forth, an unfortunate series of actions. On the other hand, there's a number of underlying dynamics that people are well aware of that underpin at least the possibility of a large-scale conflict. So how do you navigate that kind of analogy? Or maybe I have it wrong, but which part is the catastrophe? Is it the match or is it the powder keg?
Well, it's the point at which the match lights the powder keg. Of course, the great disasters of history have by and large been foreseen. There was nothing, in fact, that surprising about a pandemic. How many people had predicted it? I got to about 20 in my list of prophets, and I had to include myself because I wrote about this in a book called The Great Degeneration 10 years ago. Lots and lots of people said we had to be very worried about a pandemic. Bill Gates' TED Talk's famous, but actually there was a much better one by the epidemiologist Larry Brilliant. So that was the gray rhino effect. We saw this coming from a mile off. And the same was true of World War I. There were any number of books written about the dangers of a European war breaking out in the decades before 1914. The problem about disasters is you can see that gray rhino, but can't actually tell when that horn on its nose is going to go through your chest. Between a gray rhino and a black swan. When the disaster actually happens, oddly enough, even though we've been talking about pandemic risk for 20 years, we act very surprised. And we're like, wait, what? This is unprecedented. This is out of left field. This is a year like no other. And I found it very interesting to think about why something that's been predicted multiple times still feels like a complete surprise when it happens. The same was true in 1914. Everybody talked about the outbreak of war like a bolt from the blue at the time. And yet the same people had been discussing the risk of European war for many years. So I think we have a little bit of a cognitive problem here. We can talk and talk and talk about the dangers of pandemic, but when it strikes, we're kind of caught off balance. I think this partly is psychological. I think we as human beings aren't very good about thinking about death. We know we're going to die, but we try not to think too hard about it. It's a slightly depressing thought. See Woody Allen and the movies he made in which that subject keeps recurring. But I don't think it's just that. And this is where Alexander Hamilton would be great to bring back. Hamilton was somebody who'd grown up in a pretty dangerous part of the world when it comes to infectious disease. I mean, just staying alive in the Caribbean in the late 18th century was quite a challenge. But he was also somebody who understood the importance of state capacity better, I think, than the other founding fathers, and understood the need to build state capacity in the fledgling United States. We have a lot of state capacity, vastly more than anybody imagined was possible in the late 18th century. We have an undersecretary for preparedness, a Department for Health and Human Services, a center or centers for disease control, all the rest of it. Multiple agencies whose job it was to be prepared for a pandemic. And on paper, they were, because in 2019, a big report came out that said the US is #1 for pandemic preparedness, and the UK is #2. So the big puzzle of COVID is, why were the countries that on paper were the best prepared and employed lots and lots of civil servants to be prepared so very inept when a pandemic struck? And Doom offers an answer to that question, but I think it's the right question to ask and an appropriate question for this society to think about.
So I want to dig into that exact point in a second. I want to actually step back and touch on a larger point you made just a bit earlier, which is you find a lot of evidence that the nature of political order matters a great deal. The point you made about famines, there's never been a famine in a democratic country, indicates it's not simply a question of climate or demographics or agriculture, that there's a lot of human decision-making here. So it seems like today the zeitgeist is in some ways against that. I mean, you've titled your book or subtitled your book, The Politics of Catastrophe. To many, they're arguing that it's the catastrophe of politics, and that we'd be better off if we didn't have any politics, if we weren't a democratic polity. And for years, people will point to China and say, wouldn't it be great to be a country like China, whether that's climate change or other things, they can move quicker, harder, cleaner. And even in the first 6 months of COVID, I think we heard over and over and over again about the example, let's say, set by China and others. So I'm sure you disagree with some of that, but why do you think this keeps coming up over and over again, especially it seems like more recently?
I was rather stunned by how many articles appeared last year saying, this is the beginning of the Asian century. The Chinese are showing us how this is done. We're pathetic. What a bunch of losers we are. I mean, this article got written so many times that it was hard to fit in all the variants in the footnotes. Let's remember two things. First of all, this disaster happened because it originated in a totalitarian state. If there had been, for whatever reason, a lab leak or a natural mutation that had produced a new highly contagious coronavirus that also happened to kill the elderly in significant numbers, we would have heard about it in any democracy much sooner than we heard about it from China. Why? Because as a one-party state, China behaved exactly the same way the Soviet Union did at the time of the Chernobyl disaster. There was an overwhelming impulse from the local to the national level to cover it up. When people blew the whistle, they were told to shut up and shut down. When laboratories tried to publish information about the virus, they too were literally shut down. So I think we need to remind ourselves that this was the super Chernobyl. I mean, Chernobyl did not kill anybody outside the Soviet Union, although it spread a lot of radioactive material right across Western Europe as far as Scandinavia and even all the way to the British Isles, but nobody died. In fact, the number of people who died as a result of Chernobyl, when I came to research, it was surprisingly small. This was the super Chernobyl, and it killed, as we said before, a really significant proportion of humanity by historical standards. And certainly the number is going to run into the millions, probably not the tens of millions. So that's the first point. The second point, we made a very big mistake in thinking that the Chinese way of handling the problem that they'd started was the right one. We saw the lockdowns that were imposed after January the 23rd on Wuhan and all the restrictions that were then imposed on the rest of China. And we said, oh, that's the way to handle this. If we'd been paying attention to Taiwan and South Korea, we'd have seen that the right way to handle the disaster was very quickly to ramp up testing, very quickly to build a system of contact tracing, isolate the vulnerable, make sure the elderly care homes don't get infected, and of course, quarantine effectively any potentially infected person coming from outside. If you did all that, as Taiwan did, you could keep the number of fatalities to double digits, which they achieved until last month when they had their first real outbreak. So I think we made the mistake of copying the wrong China. The Republic of China had it right. The People's Republic did an extremely draconian response, literally welding people into their apartment blocks. We didn't quite do that, but we tried. We put whole populations in California and other states under effective house arrest for sustained periods, and this was even more true in Europe. So I think we made a couple of profound mistakes in our assessment last year, and this led to the fairy story that the crisis was exposing the weaknesses of democracy and the strengths of China. At the end of Doom, which was, of course, finished off as a book some months ago in October of last year, I said, look, we're all overestimating China's capacity and underestimating what is already a strong US response. The US response to the economic shock was certainly more impressive than the Chinese response. That is now very clear. If anything, we've overdone the response to the economic shock. And when it came to vaccination, it was already clear to me last year that the US and, for that matter, European vaccines with mRNA technology would be superior to the ones that the Chinese were producing with older forms of vaccine technology. That's turned out to be even more true than I foresaw. I had to write before the phase 3 results were out from Moderna and Pfizer. If you told me when I was writing it, dude, they're going to be like 95% effective, I would have been cracking open the champagne. But I knew they'd be better than the Chinese vaccines, and it turns out they're a lot better. So I do think that we've kind of misread this crisis, partly because, and this goes to your point, we're so convinced that our democratic politics is a catastrophe. There's such a revulsion against populism in the media. This was not confined to anti-Trump sentiment and Trump derangement syndrome. You had the same thing in the UK, anti-Johnson, anti-Brexit sentiment. It's very widespread. The perception that there's a crisis of democracy leads to the wrong inference, which is, oh, the reason we have excess mortality is that we elected these populist goons. And that's actually a wrong inference. I do not think it would have made the slightest difference, or at least it would have been only a slight difference, if we'd had Joe Biden as president 12 months early. If Biden had been president January 2020, by some quirk of political history, I don't think the outcome in terms of public health would have been very different. And I think it's hard for liberal journalists to admit that, because their prior is to hate Trump And it's also hard because Trump said so many dumb things last year about the virus. And yet I don't believe that he really was the key variable. He may have made things somewhat worse at the margin, but with Biden as president a year early, I think we would still be looking at 500,000 in excess mortality.
Do you think that this misperception, let's say, even if it's widespread, is what is underpinning the Biden administration's international policy, or at least the framing of it? I mean, even just this week at the G7, the president talks a lot about this is a battle about which works better for people, democracy or autocracy, about who can function better, who can deliver for their people better. And it seems like so much even of the large legislative efforts that the administration is trying to push through are almost downstream from that concept. But it seems it may be based on this idea that maybe democracy isn't delivering, and COVID being the latest expression of that. Do you see some of that in there?
I think this is a good line for President Biden to take, and I'm glad that that his national security team, and credit to Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, are taking the president in this direction, because I don't think it was his impulse. I mean, if you go back to the very beginning of Joe Biden's campaign to be president, he was at first dismissive of the hypothesis that China poses a fundamental threat. And then he was taken aside by his campaign team, and they said, look, you've got to be tougher on China than Trump or you lose. He got the message. He completely shifted his position from they're not a threat, folks, to they are a threat. Good. It's high time the United States woke up to the nature of the Chinese threat. Donald Trump was the alarm clock that went off. Now, finally, there's a bipartisan recognition that we face a profound threat, and not only in terms of public health. I mean, you mentioned climate change. If you're really serious about climate change, then we need to talk about China, because half the increase in CO2 emissions, 48%, since Paris, or for that matter, since Greta Thunberg was born, is due to China. If we're going to have a talk about climate change, we have to have a talk about how we constrain China from building a new coal-burning power station each week. So I do think it's good that the Biden administration is taking this line and saying, look, we have to show that democracy and the rule of law are superior to the various forms of authoritarianism out there. And I think the good news is that actually, 18 months on, it's much easier to make that argument than it was maybe 12 months ago, when it seemed as if the democracies were collectively screwing COVID up. Let's remember, democracies don't often get things right immediately. It's not like the US started World War II off really successfully. And I think one could point to a number of other occasions in history when it's felt like, in Churchill's famous phrase, the United States always does the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. But I think that's part of the nature of the democratic system. Ultimately, we do not reward leaders for preemption. We do not reward leaders for taking early action that averts disaster. We rather prefer to have the disaster and then see it get fixed. This is a problem Kissinger talked about in his famous essay on the problem of conjecture way back in the 1960s. I think this is true. We don't reward successful preemptive acts, and that condemns us as democracies to kick the can down the road and play for time and hope that things turn out well. And then when the disaster's upon us, to be slightly slow in our response. But when we get our act together, in fact, our systems are better at coping because they're less centralized, because there's more accountability, because there's a free press. We are compelled to get things right. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is not so much in our democratic institutions. The problem is in our bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy, which has got ever larger over time, the administrative state that evolved really in its modern form since the 1970s, told us that it had this covered, and we believed them. And we were taken in by the illusion of preparedness. I think it's very interesting that this is coming out already in the UK, where Dominic Cummings delivered devastating testimony 2 weeks ago on what he saw as Boris Johnson's chief advisor during the early phase of the pandemic. And I think the most interesting thing about his testimony was not what he said in a critical spirit about Johnson. It was the fact that it was a systemic failure, according to Cummings, that it wasn't just the elected politicians, but it was the civil servants and the public health experts who essentially bungled at the beginning, failing to see the nature of the challenge they faced. So I'm very, very keen that we should have a similar conversation in the US. Right now, there's a dangerous temptation. I encountered it when I appeared on Morning Joe a few weeks ago to say, now we have a good president who follows science, everything will be fine. Like we fixed things. But we have not fixed things just by changing president. The same kind of pathologies exist, I suspect, in every agency of the federal government and probably most state governments. And whatever disaster strikes next, and remember, you don't get to choose. You don't get any forewarning about which disaster is next. I'll bet you that the preparedness plans for that disaster turn out to be about as useless as the plans were for a pandemic.
It sounds like what you're saying, and I won't put the exact words in my mouth. It sounds like what you're saying is it's actually a failure of the deep state, just a different one, let's say, than the former president might have thought. It's a kind of middle management, head of bureaucracy.
Yeah, I steer clear of the phrase deep state because it slightly has the QAnon feel to it. Administrative state is a good term. Chris DeMuth, who used to run AEI, wrote a brilliant essay on this a few years back, anatomizing what it was that had happened and making the point that beginning really in the Nixon administration, Congress had punted difficult issues to federal agencies, and there had been a proliferation of these agencies. And they're really, I think, where the problem lies. And there's no ill intention. I'm sure the people who work at the Centers for Disease Control are filled with good intentions. It's just that they completely screwed up testing. I mean, they completely screwed it up. So to the point that the US was lagging far behind a whole host of countries in its ability to test because CDC not only prevented non-government agencies like Stanford University from getting testing to happen, it also produced its own testing kit that did not work. Now, that's the kind of sclerotic bureaucratic response that I think we've seen in other crises. This is not new. I think the response of agencies to the gathering financial storm in 2006, 2007 was the same. On paper, we had bank capital adequacy well regulated. We had regulators on the mortgage market. There was lots and lots of people gainfully employed regulating US financial services in 2007. It's just that they totally failed to prevent the biggest financial crisis since 1929. So I don't think COVID is new in the sense of revealing these problems at the level of the administrative state, but we still haven't processed that that's our challenge, fixing these sclerotic agencies that are very good at giving the impression of preparedness because cover your ass is their motto. You know, let's have a 36-page plan plus PowerPoint deck that tells the folks in Washington, we have this covered, and let's just hope that it's never put to the test. I mean, for me, one of the aha moments of writing the book was coming across a lecture by Robert Cadleg, the guy whose job it was. He was the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness in 2018, shortly after there had been a pandemic preparedness plan published, in which he said, you know, if we don't get this right, if we don't really do this, then we'll be shit out of luck if there is a pandemic. And if the guy whose job it is knows the preparedness plan is basically useless, you've got a problem. And we've got the same problem, I suspect, regardless of the contingency that you discuss. I bet you there's a brilliant earthquake preparedness plan in Sacramento somewhere. It's just that when there is an earthquake in California, it'll turn out to be useless.
So how do we reward? You said we don't reward leaders for preparation or for preemptiveness, let's say, as if the Trump administration in early January of last year had shut down travel, ordered lockdowns, you know, he might have gotten impeached for a different reason, let's say. If he had done it as he did partially and belatedly, let's say in mid-March, he was accused of acting too late. Is there a way to actually do this to get around this problem? Or at the end of the day, I mean, this is functionally the argument that people will make against a democratic system. They say, well, the incentive structure is such that I have no real incentive to be able to do that. Whereas if I can take the longer view, maybe I do have that incentive. How do we do that?
It's a great question. You're absolutely right. When Trump did try to shut down travel from China, and he was quite quick to see that we needed to do that in January, He was castigated in the New York Times and the Washington Post, on CNN, for the xenophobic, racist impulse that this betrayed. Actually, the only thing that was wrong with Trump's travel ban was that it was about 2 weeks too late, and there were loopholes, like U.S. passport holders weren't constrained by it. And so we can see that there's a specific problem, that anything Trump did was going to be condemned, even when he did something right. But there's also a general problem that whoever is president is not incentivized to take early action, because any action has costs. And it's much easier just to hope for the best. And you can see how the conversations went. I mean, I was privy to some parts of them back in January, February, early March. You had people in the administration like Matt Pottinger, or people in Senate like Tom Cotton, who understood that this could be very, very bad indeed. And they'd understood it early. And then there were the people on the economics team or on the election campaign team who were saying, oh, we can't do anything that might trigger a financial crisis, or that might trigger a recession. We've got an election to win in November. And so let's just not take any early action that might be unnecessary. It could just be the seasonal flu. Let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. And that kind of conversation was going on everywhere. It wasn't just happening in London and Washington. It was happening in the same way in Berlin. It was happening in Paris. That's how democracies work. So I think we need to ask the question, not how do we change the incentives of democratically elected leaders? We are not going to be able to do that. The problem of conjecture is going to be there. What we need to do, I think, is to change the incentives of the bureaucracy. If the incentive is produce a 36-page plan plus PowerPoint deck, and then you're done on a Friday at 5, we're going to keep making this mistake. Let's look at what the Taiwanese and the South Koreans got right, and why they got it right. First, I think the why. If you are living right next door to a state that wishes to take you out, whether it's China in the case of Taiwan or North Korea in the case of South Korea, you have a reason to be paranoid, and you have a reason to be on, as it were, on edge. And you have a reason to be quick on the draw, whatever they throw at you. When I was in Taipei in January of last year, they were worried about election interference from Beijing, but they were also ready for the fact that the new pathogen in Wuhan might well be transmitted from people to people. And so they didn't believe the Chinese government when it denied that. I think we need to cultivate a rapid reaction paranoid mentality and reward people in government agencies for swiftness of response, not for Cassandra-like prophetic powers. You can predict any crisis you like every year of your life. I know academics who've made a living out of predicting a financial crisis every year since 2001, and they got lucky in 2008, and they've been giving speeches on the back of that ever since. We don't want Cassandras because you can't predict the next disaster. You can make that prophecy and get lucky one day, but you're just the stopped clock. Forget the Cassandras, because there are too many of them and there are too many prophecies. Focus on rapid response. Nimbleness. You want to react quickly to the first tremor of the big earthquake, and you want to react quickly to the first news of a pathogen that could well be as deadly as 1918-19. What we need to do is change the way in which our agencies, our government agencies, and also this is true, I think, for private sector entities, change the way they think about risk and uncertainty, and emphasize swiftness of response. This is what the Taiwanese are really good at. It's partly because under Audrey Tang's direction, they've understood how to use technology to make government more accountable to citizens, not the other way around, as in the Chinese mainland. And we have not yet done that. On the contrary, the interface between citizens and the state online is terrible in almost every part of the US government, right down to the DMV. So we have to really overhaul that interface between citizens and the state so that the state becomes more accountable and quicker on the draw. That's where I think we can make meaningful changes, accepting that we'll never quite change the incentives of democratically elected leaders.
So just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, you can submit them in writing through the Q&A function. It sounds like what you're saying almost is that complacency is maybe the best explanation almost for this bureaucratic national complacency, and societies, states like South Korea, Taiwan, Israel, others that don't have that luxury. And that shows up also in huge amounts of innovation startup, et cetera, that this also might extend to these questions of, longer term or at least quick to decide, risk taking necessarily societies. Does that augur well or poorly, let's say, for whether it's the United States competition with China or others? It sounds like the scourge you've identified, let's say, which is complacency at the middle management level, can extend way beyond a response to catastrophe. It could extend, to quite a number of things. So has this exercise that you've gone through over the last year and a half of researching and writing this, has that left you more or less optimistic about how the United States might actually compete into the future?
I think it depends on how we learn from this. I think we have an opportunity to realize what went wrong and to ask the question, could the same thing go wrong when there's a cyber attack? Just to give the most obvious example, at this point, it seems to me the probability of escalation in conflicts between the US and China is quite high. I've been arguing for a while that we're in Cold War II. It's hidden in plain sight, but that's where we are. And the more we accept that, the better we'll do. Because once you realize you're in a Cold War with China, then you'll take much more effective action to prevent intellectual property theft and espionage. And you will also compete where you need to compete in strategically vital areas of technology. It is obvious to anybody who thinks about this for an afternoon that in the event of an escalation, say over Taiwan or the South China Sea, that we will find ourselves on the receiving end of sustained cyber attack designed to impact critically our infrastructure. And we all know that if the internet went down and the cell phone stopped working, this country would be in a kind of Mad Max state within a rather alarmingly short space of time. I wonder how ready we are for that. I'm sure there's a cyber attack preparedness plan somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon, but do you have a plan? Do I have a plan? Do we know what the plan is? No, because it's all shrouded in secrecy. And that means that we're not drilling. No organization that I'm associated with has practiced how we would deal with a full-blown outage. I don't know of anybody who's thought seriously about what we do if the electricity grid is taken down. We've had little trailers of the movie, the Colonial Pipeline being one, but actually cyber attacks are going on all the time at varying levels. The big one, where they try to take us out at least for a significant number of days right across our infrastructure, that's the thing we need to be ready for, because that's the war of the future. I don't really care about to the Taiwan Strait. If we are knocked out in cyberspace, then it's game over. That's the kind of thing that Doom is designed to make us think about, because there are all kinds of different forms that Doom can take, and you don't get to choose. Just because we really like the idea of climate change producing disastrous outcomes, just because that's the dominant topic of conversation in elite circles, does not mean that that's the disaster we get next. I was at the Davos World Economic Forum January of last year. The agenda was dominated by climate change, and a pandemic had begun. It was already underway. And I was running around the conference hall saying, don't you realize we're having the wrong conversation here? So I think we can learn from this, but we're not yet doing it. At the moment, the takeaway is we had a populist president. No wonder we screwed up. Thank God he's gone. If that's the takeaway, then don't be surprised if the next disaster, whatever it is, we can't know, produces a very similar shambolic response, because the relevant agencies will have their plan. It just won't work.
Let me ask you a couple questions about the aftershocks, let's say, or secondary effects of catastrophes, and then after that we'll go to questions. So again, please continue to submit. Do you buy the argument that if it weren't for COVID and everything that came with it, obviously, to your point, that the politics of catastrophe, not necessarily just the virus itself, do you think that Joe Biden would have won the presidential election?
Oh no, Donald Trump would have been elected if it hadn't been for the pandemic. That's very clear. It took a very special set of circumstances to erode support for Trump amongst key voter groups. and particularly the elderly. Remember, they're the key demographic with very high turnout. They were crucial in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in 2016. And here came a public health disaster that specifically targeted that age group. And even if you were a fan of Trump in those states, it was hard to feel that he'd handled it well. I mean, you had to be deep into QAnon to believe that somehow there weren't major screw-ups happening in Washington. So I'm pretty clear, looking at the results, which after all was not the landslide that the opinion polls had predicted, that Trump would have had a second term but for COVID. And you know, even with the public health disaster, the Republicans did remarkably well down ballot, and the Democrats did very disappointingly, considering the mess the country was in November of last year. I mean, let's not forget the economy was on its knees still at that point, only beginning to show some signs of coming out of it. And the pandemic was entering its largest wave, which was the second wave that really covered Thanksgiving through to Christmas. So it's remarkable, really, how well the Republicans held up under those circumstances. Take away the pandemic, and I just don't see how Biden could possibly have won the presidency. Remember, the economy was red hot at the end of 2019. The Trump administration had delivered full employment without any inflationary downside. And this was really making an impact, particularly on the minority voters that the Democrats were counting on. Hispanic voters, even African-American voters, were beginning to feel significant benefits from the Trump economy. So in the counterfactual world, where there's no leak from a Wuhan lab in December or November of 2019, Trump is still president.
So let me ask you another question of that vein. Cryptocurrency, you know, Bitcoin among others. We've seen the last 8 months, let's say, the mainstreaming of some of these products. Do you think that mainstreaming can be explained by the pandemic, or at least the financial response to it, and the search by investors for places of better value than the US dollar?
Clearly, the financial revolution that began with Satoshi's Bitcoin paper way back in 2008 has been going for a while, and it's good that there's experimentation with respect to payments. Our payment system is antiquated. It's slow. It's dominated by incumbents who benefit from complex regulation. It takes way too long for me to pay you or you to pay me. And I think it's not surprising that given that the opportunities created by the internet, created by blockchain, we should have this revolution in the financial and monetary domain. I think it's also important for us not to think that the answer to the problem is to copy the Chinese. One of the things that worries me a bit about the Biden administration is that it slightly succumbs to the old Cold War problem that in order to meet or match your enemy, you end up becoming like your enemy. The last thing we need is a central bank digital currency that gives the Fed total surveillance over every transaction in the economy. There's already too much of that for law-abiding citizens to be comfortable with. So I think it's extremely interesting that the pandemic accelerated the transition to crypto, especially in countries that have much flakier institutions than the US. And this adoption of Bitcoin and of decentralized finance is healthy, not least because it will force the existing financial system to respond. I don't blame people for wanting to own Bitcoin. It was a better hedge against the inflationary downside risk of monetary policy than gold, much better. And so it's been fascinating for someone like me who kind of became a convert to Bitcoin back in 2017 and remained a convert even during the big sell-off of early 2018. I can see now that Bitcoin is too big to destroy by regulation. And I hope that what will happen in the US is that instead of just trying to copy the Chinese, we try to accept and integrate this new highly decentralized system into our existing system. Because I think Peter Thiel was right when he said, you know, crypto is libertarian, AI, artificial intelligence, is totalitarian. And we don't want an AI-based financial system. The Chinese are building that. We want something that restores what we kind of lost after 9/11, which was privacy. There should be privacy for legal activities by citizens. We need to remember that privacy is part of liberty, and we've yielded that up, I think, without a fight, to our detriment.
Let me go to questions from the audience. So let me go to Professor Peter Fever of Duke. I have unmuted you or handed you the mic, and please go ahead.
Hi, this is great, and great job now. Great to have this. You began by framing this puzzle of, the pandemic provoked this huge response, but it's looking like on track to be like the 1950s pandemic, which everyone forgets, rather than the much more significant one from the 1918. But doesn't the puzzle that you framed answer itself, which is that one of the reasons why we're on track for it to match 1950s rather than 1918 is because of our massive response. Absent that, the lethality, cumulative lethality might climb much higher. And of course, this is what we're still in the middle of it. It was we've still got several more waves probably globally before the death toll is final. So that was my question. This doesn't negate your argument about leadership. Obviously, better leadership from the top through to the bottom would have produced an even better result. So I'm not quibbling with that, but just with the framing of your puzzle.
The counterfactuals are tricky. It's not, I think, clear that we would have had 1918-19 without lockdowns. That is the claim that the other Niall Ferguson made back in March and continues to make. The Niall Ferguson at Imperial College London, who spells his first name differently from me, thankfully, because if he'd spelled it the same way as me, I'd get more hate mail than I could possibly handle. I don't think it was ever going to kill 2.2 million Americans, because even if we had not done lockdowns, as John Cochrane predicted and Austin Goolsbee proved, people would change their behavior. People changed their behavior even in the states that did almost no real restrictions. And there would have been, I think, a significant adaptive response. What happened last year was that we added a whole bunch of restrictions, many of which were, I think, of limited public health value and considerable economic harm. And so we created a much greater economic shock than was probably necessary, because we dithered around in January and February and then hit the panic button in mid-March. So I think the counterfactuals are not as they're usually presented, that we had some choice between doing nothing and getting to herd immunity without an economic hiccup, or doing much more drastic lockdowns and avoiding higher casualties. I think the reality is that those really weren't the choices. The choice was whether you could target interventions more effectively to contain spread without doing needless economic damage. And I think if you kind of rank responses in those terms, very few countries really deserve an A, and we certainly don't deserve even a B for our initial response. I don't think, though, if you look at the nature of the pathogen and the infection fatality rate, that it was ever going to be 1918-19. Because remember, firstly, the virus that went round the world in 1918 disproportionately killed young people. It was actually people in the prime of life who succumbed to the Spanish influenza. And the medical capacities that were available in those days, when people got secondary infections, when the virus generated pneumonia, were extremely limited. So I think the counterfactual that we could somehow have had 1918 had it not been for lockdowns is wrong. And that was at the heart of the Imperial College analysis that everybody bought back in mid-March. It exaggerated how lethal the virus was for the average person. And I think it also exaggerated the benefits of very draconian lockdowns.
Michael Gambuza, the microphone is yours, and please introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm a student at Wake Forest. I just had a question. You talk a lot about systemic problems and political problems. Oh, there's a thing. During your argument. And so my question was more along a cultural line. Is the failure of our government during this opening phase of the pandemic as cultural as it is political? Because you mentioned the dysfunction of political hierarchy in several chapters Challenger, Chernobyl, et cetera. But is it valid that our overwhelming sense of independence as Americans in comparison to our Asian counterparts doomed us as much as our political ineptitude? And I think you touched on this a little bit with infodemics in chapter 9. I just want to hear a little bit more about it.
It's a question that's come up in various forms quite a bit. The kind of argument I've often heard, which I think is similar to the one you're making, is, well, we're too individualistic and liberty loving to be able to make to have a Taiwanese response, because how would we ever submit to a contact tracing app given our sense of individualism and our love of liberty? And this has always struck me as a crazy argument, because the Taiwanese had many fewer restrictions on their ordinary lives last year than we did. If you really love liberty, why would you choose house arrest over a contact tracing app? Particularly when it's not that difficult to anonymize data and make sure that your contact tracing app isn't going to become some tool of a future big brother. I do think that you're right to ask a cultural question, because it's not just about institutions, even although I tend to prefer institutional to cultural arguments. But I think the cultural problem is not so much with American voters, with American citizens. I think the culture problem is a slightly different one, and I'll give it two parts. Part one we've already talked about, which is the peculiar psychology or culture of American bureaucracy, which is not exclusive to the United States, but I think in the US is a very peculiar form. Because of the way in which law schools contribute a significant number of people to our political system, the mentality of the American legal profession, the fear of the class action lawsuit, the desire to create enormously comprehensive documents ex ante that cover every eventuality. That mentality definitely, I think, ties in to the administrative state's malfunction. The second cultural phenomenon is, I think, of quite recent origin, and that is our desire to turn everything into a partisan issue. The belief that there is no domain of life that is not subject to partisan politics is of relatively recent provenance. In the 1950s, going back to Peter Fever's question, there was no great controversy over vaccination against the Asian flu. Everybody just wanted to get the vaccine as fast as possible and get it as fast as possible. So I think one of our biggest problems in the United States, which I strongly link to the rise of the internet, but it's not exclusively about that, is this tendency for us to turn all issues into partisan issues, to believe that everything is in the domain of partisan politics, which it really isn't. I mean, there are some things that are questions above the realm of politics, and questions of public health, I think, belong there rather than in the partisan fray.
Let me go to Robert Delfeld.
Dr. Ferguson, thank you for being with us today. Robert Delfeld, I'm a junior staffer here at AHS. I think you very rightly call for the state and our bureaucratic institutions, so to speak, to reform themselves to become, as you say, quicker on the draw, as a corrective to the inefficiencies within democratic political processes. You were preaching on this in the Great Degeneration way back when. But I'm struggling a little bit to see how those within these institutions, our civil servants, have much incentive to reform themselves in ways that you would endorse, that we would all endorse. So is it possible, my question, is it possible that politics itself is the solution, not the thing that needs to be mitigated against? Are we searching for an idiosyncratic set of presidential candidates, for example, who kind of ignore the normal political incentives to accommodate themselves to the state and instead focus on standing up to it and reforming from the top?
That's a great question. I think the answer I'd give is that the voters by 2016 in many countries discerned that there was a problem with the administrative state. And part of what led to the populist backlash of that year was the voters' frustration with the bureaucratic dysfunction that they encountered in their daily lives. The appeal of phrases like drain the swamp was precisely to that sentiment of frustration. Unfortunately, I think populism was not really the solution that the voters were hoping for. In practice, populist leaders have not done a great job of reforming the administrative state, partly because the administrative state is very good at resisting reform. This was what drove Dominic Cummings to distraction when he went into the government late in 2019 in the UK, that his idea that he was going to revolutionize Whitehall by bringing in geeks and nerds and giving them the leeway to innovate ran into the brick wall of the permanent civil service and its natural allies in the media. Because remember, one of the things that happens, and it happened last year, was that the people in the agencies that are really screwing up go to the New York Times and say it's all the fault of the president. And what's wonderful is seeing journalists accept completely uncritically testimony from people inside the administrative state without asking the question, why are they telling me this? I mean, what is their incentive? What is the incentive to brief Jim Fallon's at the Atlantic that it's all Trump's fault if you are working at CDC or DHSS? Answer to cover your ass, which is what you do for a living. So politics, in theory, has the solution because voters know the problem, but it hasn't delivered a credible solution because, unfortunately, the populists, Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, don't really have the tools to create the kind of reform that I talked about in The Great Degeneration, which is more than 10 years ago now, I think. And at that time, you know, my argument that we had to address these problems felt like a fresh one. Now I'm kind of bored of it. But what depresses me is that we've totally failed to execute. We've done almost nothing compared with the Reagan administration, which was the only administration in the entire period since Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that turned back the administrative state, shrunk the Federal Register, reduced meaningfully the burdens of regulation. So we unfortunately have to go back and think again about how, and unfortunately I'll have to kind of end on this note, despite the fact there are many great questions, because I have, as is often the case in times of book promotion, another event to get to. But I'll conclude with the thought that if Alexander Hamilton could come back and take a look at the way the federal government works today, he would say, this has gone way off track. I never envisaged something as bloated as the federal government has become. I never thought that we'd end up looking like France with a huge and somewhat parasitic administrative state and excessive power concentrated in Washington. That was not my vision. So we kind of need to remind voters that it's not enough just to elect a wrecking ball and say, go wreck the deep state. You have to get people into elected office who have, as Ronald Reagan did, a clear vision of what a reduced form state looks like. So we've got a lot of work to do. We have to go to Taiwan and sit down with Audrey Tang and say, show us how this works. How exactly did you make your response so much more nimble? And we have to then, I think, make this part of what inevitably is going to be a conservative or Republican campaign strategy, because the Democrats will never meaningfully seek to roll back the state. They are far too committed as a party, and have been for well nigh a century, to increasing its range and size. So we have a lot of work to do politically if indeed the solution can come from politics.
Well, Professor Ferguson, thank you. Doom on Zoom, but not gloom, I guess, is the way to maybe kind of sum it up in terms of your approach to it. So we appreciate you being here with us. Appreciate the insights. Maybe you can convince the governor of California that when they get a shot, they get a book as a way to incentivize them to, you know, maybe learn a lesson.
Great idea. I hadn't thought of that.
For next time around. I'll take the royalty if it ever comes to happen. But thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, everybody, and a pleasure to be part of the AHS. Hope to remain in contact with your great organization.
Wonderful. Have a great everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.